Welcome back to Living in the Gray. If you're new, we're writing a vision for the future where we reclaim the living part of our lives back, and we have content focused on 4 areas. Business beyond borders, really about the trade stack and creating those connections. Reimagining our reality, that's about building better relationships and better trust between ourselves and emerging markets. Personal wealth and well-being, our health is our wealth is our health. How can we focus on investing in ourselves, our minds, our bodies to help each other, also our businesses, and then business basics, right? Just the fundamentals. Today, though, we continue by talking about the global context that will frame much of what we'll talk about in future episodes. And today we're talking about innovation as the engine for emerging market growth. Emerging markets will be unlocked with rapid innovation. So let's think about the landscape of emerging markets today. Many have significant populations, rich cultural heritage, but the economic output, what we're producing, it just is behind a lot of the global powers. So take Africa as a continent of 54 nations, 1.5 billion people, and over 3 trillion in GDP in 2024, real GDP. While it has scale and resources, the question is, how can emerging markets, including Africa, really translate that potential into greater global economic impact? So let's break it down. Let's just even start with, when it comes to economic output, what are we talking about? The easiest way to think about this is it's what a country produces, right? So gross domestic product, or GDP, it's an economic term used to describe this output. There's a formula. This is a formula that really says it's what we consume, right? Or what we buy with the money that we have. You add that to what we invest as a nation. You add that to what our government spends. You add that to what we produce and send out that other countries buy. And then you subtract what we import, what we buy now from other countries. That shows how productive a nation is. The thing is, it's a little bit flawed, right? Like most measures, because it oversimplifies the idea that being productive equates to how well a country's citizens are doing. The thing is, GDP doesn't necessarily mean that the average citizen is actually healthy and educated and has opportunities. The Human Development Index does a bit better job at that. So if you take the two measures together, it can give you a more holistic sense of how a country is doing and how the citizens are doing. So a lot of times we're taught to think, though, of a world like a pie, where we're trying to get resources from one another. Right? We're taught in, basic economics, resources are limited, the way that you leverage your time, right? Your money, labor, land, all of these things is finite. But I think a better analogy that could actually help more of us collaborate together is that of a garden, right? Where the more positively we contribute to it, the more it grows and the more fruits of that labor are actually available for everyone. The thing is, more in this case can be done with technology, not necessarily output, right, by human beings. To that point, every year, if you think about GDP, let's say for the last 100 years, you have less and less people contributing to the workforce, right? You have less and less people technically working and more technology being used. So GDP on average has increased. But then if you think about what else has happened, productivity for the sake of productivity to make a few people wealthy also isn't very sustainable. So wealth has become more and more concentrated between a few, and it's been to the demise to some degree of others, right? But this isn't a sustainable path. If we play this exact future or this exact scenario out into the future, another 100 years, what do we have left, right? So that's the question. The key, though, is how we can unlock growth in emerging markets. And that's really what I want to focus on today. So let's take a deeper dive into some data. I had a fun time going through and looking at data across emerging markets and developed markets, really to help contextualize where we are, right? And just frame where we are, which helps us also understand the opportunities across emerging markets, including Africa. So I picked Brazil, China, India, Nigeria, and the UAE, plus an aggregate view across developing economies, really that represent this dynamic, rapidly evolving innovation landscape that will honestly reshape the way that the global economy functions and runs. And they're really challenging the established dominance of some of the developed economies, the others that I picked: France, Germany, the UK, US, and Japan. For these countries that I consider to be developed, that the world considers to be developed, directionally in population decline, right? Many of them, I think all of them are actually directionally in population decline. That means the total fertility rate, the number of babies being born every year, D is not actually keeping up with the number of people who are dying in these countries every year. The potential impacts are to the changing world order. Ray Dalio talks a lot about this. I find it very fascinating. The shifts and changes over time, right, on how different economies have grown and then fallen and faded away. So the thing is, these countries have an advantage, right, because a lot of the innovations are coming from these countries, but also their ability to quickly adapt to the speed of change and just the nature of how the innovation is changing globally. They have the ability to be at the forefront. So there are 5 really core areas that I want to talk about related to this data on this table that we see. It's very, very interesting, again, with the point of how we help to unlock innovation in emerging markets and really continue to fuel that growth. The first one is really around the illusion of scale. So if we look at the column for Africa, 54 countries, 3.1 trillion in GDP, 1.5 billion people. It's very similar to India with 3.8 trillion in real GDP, 1.49 billion people. But the nuance here, right, of course, is that even though GDP and population sizes are similar, the amount of complexity having 54 countries is a challenge. But it begs the question, what could be possible if Africa were a country? Most of the world calls it a country anyway, but that's beside the point. I think the answer, of course, though, is really complex, as we know. But if we're honest with ourselves, it wasn't that long ago when the lines were drawn for many of the countries in the scramble for Africa, both at the hands of Africans and Europeans. Resilient people that we are, though, we've figured out a way to build to where we are now, as many other economies have. And so we should reimagine what Africa as a country could actually represent for development. The other interesting point on populations, though, is that there doesn't seem to be a strong connection per se between a country's development and the population size. So if you look at India and China, right, 1.5 billion people versus the UAE at 11 million people, but then you look at their GDP per person or per capita at purchasing power parity, PPP, which basically levels things out for inflation and gives you the ability to compare across countries, it's interesting, right? It's quite stark. Nigeria alone, though, has 230 million people, right? Almost 233. It's very similar to Brazil in terms of size. But if you now took the population of Japan, the UK, and France combined, you would get the size of Nigeria. The thing is size without systems in place just creates friction. And I can tell you, just being in this Lagos, that there's a lot of friction on a day-to-day basis of just existing and living life. The economic power comes from how well a population is actually organized to produce, protect, and trade value. And value in the market is basically what someone is willing to pay, right, for a good or service. Scale without systems, which is what many of the countries across emerging markets have, is just noise. Another area that I found really interesting when it came to the illusion of scale per se is just the comparison between Brazil and Nigeria. One of the most interesting. So the population, right, of Nigeria, 233 million, a human development index score of 0.548, which is considered low. The GDP per capita based on purchasing power parity is $6,207. Now compare that to Brazil. 212 million people in their population, a human development index score of 0.76, which is relatively high or considered high. The GDP per capita, based on purchasing power parity, basically giving you the ability to compare across currencies and normalizing the value of the currency, is $21,000. Brazil's real GDP is almost 4 times that of Nigeria. So that begs the question, what did Brazil do to develop that Nigeria could learn from? There's so many lessons, especially considering a similar historical context, actually. So despite the colonial legacies that these countries have had, the inequality, the political instability, and given the wealth of natural resources, Brazil was really able to understand and develop economically, but through regional integration, right? Creating those supply chains and value chains regionally. Agricultural transformation. So not just on their natural resources around oil, but really focusing on soybeans and other crops that could help them with their export market. And then social investment. So investing in the social infrastructure required to develop their economies. So really interesting data there. If we keep going now, there are a few systemic weaknesses that I could also observe from this data set. One of them was really around the innovation gaps, right? Especially around research and development. It's very clear that countries that have higher real GDP and a human development index also spend more on research and development as a percent of GDP. The more value placed on intellectual property, right? The higher the number of patent applications and patent awards, the higher the development of an economy. It begs the question, what would it take for innovation to be more research-led in Africa? So China supersedes the rest of the world, right, in terms of the number of patent applications and patents granted. And they spend about 2.65% of their GDP on research and innovation. The United States spends more on research and development at 3.6% of GDP. The interesting thing about that in the US is that the origins of Silicon Valley are actually rooted in research. And I don't know how many people know this. The Cold War created the need for research and development into nuclear weapons, right? So during the Cold War, you have countries competing and developing nuclear weapons, which could easily take out entire countries, right? Entire regions of the world. So you had the catalyst of urgency that the governments needed to invest and needed to fund this research. And so in Stanford University, the research and development arm was created in the Valley, again, really to help figure out solutions around nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And this created the early versions even of the internet, called a RapNet at the time, creating the pathway then for transistors and semiconductors that then came years later. So very fascinating origins of Silicon Valley. If you look, though, across emerging markets, especially across Africa, R&D is mostly non-existent, right? If you look at the percent of GDP that Nigeria spends as an example, it's basically nothing, 0.13% of their GDP. India spends about 5 times what Nigeria is spending, and you can see from the development of India over the last 50 or so years, it has really significantly helped them in becoming a service-based technology country. So the thing is low R&D, weak patent generation, slow tech development, right? This highlights a major innovation and IP gap in Africa. Even in India with comparable, GDP per capita, the ideas around what's possible with more structured systems are there. Innovation isn't happening at a structural level. It's left to chance or the elites to access. It's not enough. So the next thing that I really then looked at was around market fragmentation. It's on the language, right? The development, the language and cultural complexity of our countries. It's a strength, but it's just not yet leveraged. It's not used. It's easier to connect with one another, build trust, and do business together when you have a shared common language in which to speak and do business and transact in. There's so many languages that make it hard to do business across borders. If you have one official language, the reality on ground, especially across Africa, is that the further you go from major cities, the more languages you'll find. And the more languages you find, the harder it is for those businesses to scale in their regional areas. Africa, Nigeria, right, where I am, are culturally rich, but not unified in communication, which impacts the systems like legal language infrastructure, right, and the judicial system. This makes scaling content, tech platforms, commerce, and policy just really hard and really inefficient. It's not the diversity, right, of cultures and languages that's a problem. It's the unifying infrastructure that actually makes it more of a challenge. Okay, the other thing that I looked at was then some of the trade-offs of building without systems. And I was thinking to myself, if you need to be brilliant in order to survive your system, the system's broken. It's not working. It's not working. Most economies across emerging markets, including across Africa, are built on hustle, right? And not infrastructure. The idea that education, health, income per person, there are so many challenges. If you look at the Human Development Index scores across these different countries, it's still relatively low, right? In Africa at 0.562. It's improving, but it's still very, very slow. We're running economic models that honestly require you to be superhuman in order to survive it, right? Instead of designing it in such a way to help people thrive. And this just leads to people burning out, right? People leaving and people wanting to find progress in other places. But all of that said, after looking at all of this data, it's what is the opportunity, right? What is the opportunity here? Because at the end of the day, a lot of these emerging markets are, in fact, the future. And so, what would a rewire look like? If we look at the trade stack, infrastructure, right, that's required in order to make the connections between these emerging markets, the compliance layers that allow us to transact and build trust and have that trust across markets. Being able to make payments is sort of the next step, right, in that trade stack. Being able to have currency flow between countries easily. The demand, of course, so building up the demand, creating those relationships and those networks so that people are aware of your products and services in other countries. And then the intelligence, leveraging that data to feed back into this trade stack and this system is really what many of our emerging markets need. But we live in the world now of AI, right? And AI could be such a powerful tool to help create more of the structure that we're talking about in translating or coordinating or optimizing across these different languages. The other thing is we need to get our priorities straight. There's a lot of vanity projects, statues, and random things that are being done, but we really need to focus more on what would it take to create long-term value for the citizens of the countries that we're talking about, right? R&D, manufacturing, digital infrastructure. So that's a look at the data, again, to just help us contextualize the markets that we're operating in and to have an understanding of some of our competitors, some of the people that we should be looking towards or countries we should be looking towards in terms of inspiration on what's possible. Our emerging markets don't need to be saved. This has to be said, right? With grants and aids, we just need to get structured. The good news, we're the ones who can build that structure. It takes innovation, but we have to understand the history, the context of our environment before we can get to where we want to go. So tell me, what do you think is the most underleveraged part of our system? Comment below. Let's get this conversation going, and I'll see you in the next episode.